Good morning, everyone. It's a beautiful day out there, although maybe you're like me. I've gotten to the point where I open my front door and it's a beautiful cloudless day and I think, God, again? There's a little bit of a change in perception going on, and I think maybe that's a good thing. Congratulations to PCL, your brilliant planning, scheduling this right at the peak of what may be the worst drought in historical record for modern California. Great planning, or maybe it's their fault that this is going on. So I don't have a lot of time. I'm just going to make some introductory remarks. There's a great day worth of detailed sessions on a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about, or Tim's going to talk about, or Jacob. I'm going to describe the system that we have that we maybe wouldn't have designed if we were designing it from scratch. I'm going to talk a little bit about an anti-vision, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about a positive vision for where I think maybe we should be discussing where we're going. And that's all I'm going to do in the short time I have. So let me start by saying we have a water system today that if we were designing it today would look completely different. We wouldn't design the system we have today if we were designing it today. Well, we didn't design it today. We've designed it over decades, 100 years of incremental construction of infrastructure and design and operating rules and an evolving set of institutions and management structures and so on. And that's the system that we have today. And so the anti-vision, which really I guess is where we are today, is if we were designing a system that wouldn't work right, we would design a system that treated groundwater and surface water as completely unrelated separate things. We would design a system where ecosystems and environmental values were an afterthought or not a thought at all. We would design a system, ironically enough, in a capitalist society where we value a certain kind of economics. We would design a system where pricing and markets played no role or a completely inadequate role. We would design a system where the first person who showed up had the right to use water forever. And that's the way we would design our water rights systems. We would design a system where our urban planning was completely done with no attention to resource availability. And we put our biggest city in the driest, remotest part of the state where water is really not available, and we'd have to move a lot of water to it. Okay, so that's the system that we wouldn't design if, you get the idea. And that's the system we have today. So what now? We have a system. We have a set of physical and institutional and economic structures that manage and deliver our water and our water services. And it's not what we would design if we were designing it today. But we have limited ability to redesign the system. We have a lot of concrete in place. We have a lot of institutional structures that are sort of like concrete in place. They're as hard to move or change as the physical part of our system. So we have a limited ability to change what we have, but we have a growing awareness that what we have in place today isn't working. It works for some of us some of the time. It doesn't work for all of us all of the time. And in a situation like today where we have an incredibly severe drought and we don't know how bad it's ultimately going to be, Australia was in this situation, and they had a 1-year drought and then a 2-year bad drought and then a 3-year bad, and it turned into a 9-year. They call it the Millennium Drought, started in the year 2000. And at the end of that drought, they were doing things that they couldn't conceive of at the beginning of that drought. And we may be in that same kind of a situation where a year or two from now or 3 years from now, we may be forced to to do things that we can't even conceive of today. And I'd like to talk for the last couple of minutes about that different vision. Despite the fact that we have a limited ability to really fundamentally change the system, we do have an ability to change the system. There are levers that we can pull depending on our level of desperation, maybe the best way to put it, or the urgency, or the perception, or our willingness to really do things differently. And so here's some of the things that we could do. What we will do, I think, depends on things that we'll be talking about later today, and it depends on how bad the drought is, and it depends on our willingness to talk among ourselves in ways that we have, and cooperate among ourselves in ways that we haven't yet. But a positive vision for the state would include truly integrated surface water and groundwater use. I realize what we have. Let's ignore what we have for a moment. But it's time that we managed our surface water and our groundwater together. Now, there are lots of ways we could do that, and some people think, well, it's ridiculous that we don't have statewide legislation on monitoring and enforcement and allocation of groundwater. All right, so that's one approach, but another approach is local groundwater management. And we have lots of examples already of successful integrated local groundwater management. And I'm ambivalent. I don't feel like we have to have a state law on groundwater regulation. I sort of like that idea, but believe me, I'm content to see comprehensive but local integrated groundwater and surface water systems. And I think we're going to move in that direction. I think that's inevitable. I think we could modify pricing and rate structures. And if there's any year in which the failures of our pricing and rate structures are going to become obvious, it's going to be this year. Now, we've seen some of that problem in the past already, but we have this balance between covering fixed costs and the incentive to sell water to cover your fixed costs, and the disincentive to promote conservation and efficiency because of the challenge of revenue. And all right, so those are big issues, but they're not insolvable. They are solvable. There are rate designs and rate structures that we could put in place that permit us to encourage conservation and efficiency and smart use, but also permit our urban and, I would argue, our agricultural districts to do the things they want, to build their reserves, to cover their costs, to continue to operate the way they need to operate. So that requires some new and innovative economics. But there, again, there are great examples around the state of successful, smart pricing and rate structures. And part of that also is a different economic view about transfers. And there's been a lot of discussion, given the drought, about encouraging transfers, and we'll see more and more of that, but part of that is an economic issue as well. Third, we have to maintain and expand innovative ecosystem protection. And Jacob's going to talk more about this, and there are other people who are going to talk more about this, but if we sacrifice the modest gains we've made in ecosystem protection on the altar of drought response, that would be a mistake. What we have to do is we have to think about, even under circumstances of severe drought, how can we protect ecosystem values? Ignoring ecosystem values is a 20th century thing. It's not a 21st century idea. And so figuring out how to maintain a healthy ecosystem is also part of an innovative vision for the future. It's not fish versus farms. That's ridiculous. And actually, if there's any drought where you can't blame it on the fish, it's this drought. Fourth, we have to have a massive expansion of conservation and efficiency. The Institute's worked a lot on this issue, as some of you know. We've worked on the potential for urban and agricultural efficiency. We define conservation differently than efficiency. There are things we do in the short term that are different than the things we do in the long term. We're going to have to do some short-term things because of the drought, the take shorter showers, the let your lawns go brown, the don't wash your car, voluntary kinds of things that always provide a buffer for us during a drought, and we'll do those things. But there are permanent things that have to do with efficiency, which we define as doing what we want with less water. that we also have to do. And we put out a report at the Institute a year or two, maybe more than that, called Where's California's Next Million Acre Feet Going to Come From? And we looked at a combination of urban and agricultural efficiency improvements that could produce easily, cost-effectively, 1 million acre feet. If we had implemented those, in theory, there would be 1 million more acre feet of water in our reservoirs today. Or 1 million less acre feet of demand today. That's just a little hint of some of the potential strengths of conservation and efficiency. We need to do much more of that. I'm supposed to stop, but 2 more things. Massive expansion of recycled water use. We're moving in that direction, but we need to do a lot more. That's a source of supply that we're not adequately addressing. Better integration of state and federal agency operations, and maybe reoperations of some of our infrastructure, and operating it differently under conditions of climate change. And I'm not going to say much about climate change except this. It's real, it's caused by humans. The biggest impacts are going to be on water resources in the state of California, and we're already seeing some of those impacts. And if we don't start integrating that into our planning better than we do today, all of these droughts, man-made or not, are going to be worse. And then finally, a discussion about water rights. And I'm not going to say much more about that. There will be some more discussion about that here, but there are things that we can do on the water rights front that are different. So I'm going to stop. I look forward to the discussion today. It's going to be a very interesting year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. That was great at kicking us off. I will say, since PCL works in the Capitol, I definitely appreciate the approach of statewide legislation focusing on integrating groundwater and surface water. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Tim Quinn from Aqua to talk about their vision for water and some opportunities for collaboration therein.
And I'm just going to do it from here.
That's fine.
PowerPoint free, note free. I see a lot of familiar faces out there. It's nice, let me put it this way, it's nice to be back. Several times I have appeared at these symposiums, although you have to go back to the early 1990s. But I do see a lot of familiar faces. A number of my member agencies are sitting in the audience. I know why East Bay Mud's here and Sonoma County's here. I don't know why Martin's here from the city of Fresno. We'll have to talk about it. There are people here who have sued me or the organization I work for. Tony Rossman comes to mind. But I'm sitting in this chair today because my good friend Jonas Mitten, Jonas and I have had a constructive relationship for a quarter century. He suggested it might be time to come and sit down in this chair and talk about the things that we have in common. I will tell you, I think we have a lot more in common than some of you might think after I listened to Peter, who didn't say, I'm sure we would argue around the details, but we would not argue around the framework of Peter's vision. So are we recording this? Yeah, we are. And I'll be defending myself. I want to talk, let me start with things I think there's a lot of agreement on, and then I want to transition to things in which maybe there's not so much agreement, but there's probably a framework that we can work our differences out on. On things that I think we have more agreement than you might think, I want to talk about groundwater and investments in efficiency and things like recycling water. On the groundwater front, okay, a decade ago, my organization's position was local control, local control, local control. And if the locals wanted to abuse that authority, well, local control was the only thing we thought about. That was basically our position on both groundwater and water use efficiency investments. It was up to the locals. If they didn't want to do it, they didn't have to do it. That's not our position anymore. I work for a very large board of directors, very diverse. I had a board meeting yesterday. They are growers in the San Joaquin Valley and people who fish in the Pacific Northwest, and some prominent environmentalists sit on my board of directors. It's not the crusty old folks in overalls that you're thinking of for an Aqua board of directors. One of the things I asked them to do is to establish policy principles. And I've come to learn it's not getting them to agree with me, it's getting them to agree with themselves. That's my job. And I would invite you to go to aqua.com, which is our website. And there's about a dozen policy principles. There is meat on those bones. On the groundwater policy principles, we started at 100,000 feet, just saying we ought to be doing something about this. We did a document that we call the framework document, which basically laid down that we will always, you got to respect the guy's local politics. I'll respect yours, you have to respect mine. And I can never let go of local control of these resources, but the locals must be held to some standard of accountability. You have to manage that groundwater towards sustainable long-term outcomes for both your economy and the local environment, and that's the essence of the framework document that was done just a couple of years ago. Created a very different dynamic. We could local control, but local control that must be held accountable, that you have to do good policy, and if you don't, Aqua's not going to stand between you and the state if the state needs to solve a problem. And it's a similar issue. We now, by the way, since the groundwater issue has gotten, I was scared by that more before I was scared by the drought in the last couple of years. Without this drought, you've got a scary situation in groundwater in the state of California. And we have to wrestle with it. Water managers, local water managers have to be part of the responsible actors there. And so we are in open dialogue with the State Water Resources Control Board, Andy. My board of directors has formed a groundwater task force with the experts from around the state and my board members who care a lot about these issues. And basically, they got to run faster than that grizzly bear that's after them. And they know that. That means making hard decisions that they were probably not willing to make in the past, but to make them in ways that will solve the problem in which they can maintain local control. Same thing is true on the efficiency side. Just very briefly, we may argue about magnitude, although not that much. If you can show me a way to get a recycling project done, I want to do it. And I want to. Oftentimes that requires some public stimulus because some of these projects are expensive, and you want to get the locals to decide to do something that's too expensive from a local perspective. So let's pass some more bonds. Let's figure out other financing mechanisms to make those things happen. We also have conservation principles on the Aqua website. They were interestingly the most controversial of all the dozen or so sets. The one in which I got my phone was ringing with angry people on the other end of it. It was conservation, and the phone was mostly being run by Northern Californians who viewed conservation as some taking of their water right, and they needed to get past that, quite frankly. The Southerners got it a long time ago under programs that I helped develop when I was at the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. Truthing myself out, the South is doing okay during this drought, partly because they did what they did over the last 20 years. They spent $4 billion fairly wisely, and I think we can all learn from that instead of condemning them. Let me transition to stuff that I think there may be more controversy about between myself and some of the people in this room. Let's talk about things like the tunnels and the BDCP. Now, I know many of you probably think my organization is unreservedly for those tunnels and for the BDCP. We're Aqua. We're the water guys that caused the problem in the first place. It might surprise you to find out that that's not where Aqua has ever been. We have never taken a position to support the BDCP. I have members all over the map on the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, from those who desperately want to see it successful to those who couldn't wait to sue it. Our response to that was not all that different from the response that you had. I don't want to paint you too closely to the portfolio approach, because I know you only said let's study this instead of let's support it. But from Aqua's perspective as a statewide organization, the answer to this problem was to stop talking just about the Delta, just about the tunnels, and to start talking about a statewide program that makes sense for everyone. I represent agencies above the Delta, below the Delta, and in the Delta. And it needs to work for all of them for my board to be happy, and when my board's happy, I'm happier. So from Aqua's perspective, the critical thing was to put it into a statewide context, to put those tunnels into the proper context of something that works for the state as a whole. We've spent 5 months, we're very bottom up, we're very participative. We've spent 5 months with scores of my members and maybe 100 people involved to develop something we call the Statewide Water Action Plan. It looks a lot like the governor's action plan at this point in time. And part of our strategy was to get the governor off of tunnels only onto statewide. And I think his State of the State speech, if he lives it, he was certainly talk that sounded a lot better than me than the tunnel only approach that was coming from before. Lastly, just a word on storage. Again, I couldn't agree more with Peter's characterization of the need to invest in local resources, recycling, conservation. I've got a lot of members interested in that ocean desal stuff, so we'll politely disagree to some extent on that. I think we'll all agree it's not anything close to panacea. But if you invest in 100 units of recycling water, as Peter was mentioning, it's an alternative source of supply, and then it reduces demands in the drought. If you invest in that and you invest in storage, you don't have 1 unit of supply when the drought comes. You have 4 or 5 because you reduced your consumptive demands that you otherwise would have used, and you have something that you can manage. So if you combine storage with those local resource investments in environmentally smart ways consistent with co-equal goals, that is why Southern California is not going to be banging on Andy Sawyer's door to change the rules to benefit water supply. Oh, by the way, the changes that are happening aren't going to benefit water supply. They're at 0. They're probably going to stay at 0. It's not about shipping water south at the expense of the environment. It's about how do you survive in possible circumstances. We just don't have the assets to manage the system to meet the rules that assume there's some water in the system when there's no water in the system. But again, my former employer, I've been down, spent a little time with Jeff Keitlinger saying, can we please message this better? But they've got a crisis down in Southern California, but it's manageable. It's manageable because they reduced their demands by 25% over the last 20 years. While population was growing by 5 million in their service area, their demands have gone from 2.4 million down to 1.8 million. They invested heavily in storage so that when they weren't using that water during the wet periods, they had something they could put into storage in a way that's much better for the environment. Because you're storing essentially a reduction in consumptive demand. Those two tools together are very powerful, and they're, I think, what will allow us to really support and agree about co-equal goals in future dry years. But you need, again, our vision is check the box next to all of the above. We have to have a diverse, comprehensive set of tools implemented, and we will fight for the next quarter century over what does co-equal goals mean. I like that argument better than the one we were having 25 years ago. And so again, I think there's actually a lot more in common. We're at least, I've been involved in lots of complex public policy negotiations, and what I always wanted to know was what's the framework? Do we have a framework that we can start working our differences out on? I believe we have that framework today. I don't think that there's a lot of difference of opinion on the key elements of the framework. So ACWA would look forward to working with some or all of you to try and find out other ways in which we can bring the conservation community and the water supply community closer together so we can all move forward in this glorious vision of co-equal goals.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And between the first 2 presentations, I've got a lot of questions, so I'm biting my tongue until after our next presentation. Jacob, talking on a local ground, on a local level, how does this actually work on the ground? Let's see.
Well, as I wait for that to come up, I will give a brief introduction. So Jonas and Bruce asked me here this morning to really give kind of an on-the-ground description of what a multi-benefit project might look like, a project that meets the needs of multiple constituencies. Great. In this case, we're really talking about Yolo Bypass, just 10 miles from here, between Davis and Woodland and Sacramento, and which is really the backbone of our flood control system here in the valley. So anything we do out there is going to be flood neutral, actually increase the flood capacity of the system. So how can we have an on-the-ground project that meets flood control needs, that is actually good for agriculture, that increases habitat benefits for fish and for waterfowl, for multiple species? And to explain that, we really have to kind of take a little trip down the science rabbit hole. I know we're going to be talking about policy and politics most of the day, so bear with me for the next 7 minutes as we run down and talk about fish, my favorite topic. So really we're going to just talk about the interface between Chinook salmon and our water infrastructure, and how Peter very articulately put forth this idea that a water infrastructure designed in the 19th and 20th century is really inhibiting our ability to meet 21st century objectives, even to understand and imagine what a 21st century water infrastructure really looks like. The key from my perspective is this, that water infrastructure was built at a time when we knew very little about biology, when we gave it very little consideration, and long before the environmental constraints, legislative and otherwise, existed. This was long before the ESA, that we built Fremont Weir, that we initiated the processes which have led to the system that we have today. So let's think a little bit about how Chinook actually interfaced with that water infrastructure. It's very intuitive. A salmon leaping, slamming its nose into a cement wall, we all intuitively understand. That's a bad issue, right? There's real conflict there. And of course, we're familiar with the way that California's water infrastructure has altered the environment available to salmon. Here on your left, we have the Central Valley, the San Joaquin and Sacramento tributaries, available to salmon before water development. Each of these squares represents a dam around the valley, and we have proceeded to remove almost 80% of spawning habitat for fish. Now that's an old story. It's a story that has driven salmon management for really the entire history of salmon management in the state, and it's real. It's a problem, but it's not the only problem. And this is what we're talking about, understanding how salmon interact with the water infrastructure and how that system, the natural system, worked previous to our alteration of it is absolutely integral to creating a system that works, that achieves this idea of co-equal goals. So how do we do that? Well, the salmon life history, like any chain, is only as strong as its weakest link. And the other major aspect of California's water infrastructure is levees. Over 13,000 miles of levees in the state, right? Well, while that idea of a salmon slamming into a dam, that's intuitive, the idea that levees affected the salmon life history has not been. Why would they do, what did they do? Well, levees have reduced the floodplain, the marshlands, the wetlands adjacent to our stream channels. California's water infrastructure forces us to think that a river is just a ribbon of water between two rip-rap banks. A salmon tells you that that is not the case, right? The adjacent areas to the river, as floodwaters would spill over natural levees, spread out. Water spreading out in those wetlands warms just a little bit. This is midwinter. It's not warm, but it's warmer than the channel itself. It grows a little algae. Algae grows bugs. Bugs are fish food. Why is that up there? It's as simple as this. Fish have to eat. We've built a system that denies that fact. That lunch buffet that was our marshlands has been cut off from salmon. My mom always told me, the first thing you do when you're going on a long trip is pack a lunch. That's exactly what we've denied these salmon. So the Cosumnes River comes in here. Work done here at UC Davis over the last 3 decades has fundamentally led to a different idea of what salmon habitat is, right? You've probably all seen this picture. My colleague, Carson Jeffries, did his master's work on the Cosumnes, on the lower stretches of the Cosumnes River where it empties into the delta. This is one of the last remaining places, a postage stamp of a place that has a functioning riparian and floodplain ecosystem. And he did this very simple project. He built little cages and he put some on the floodplain and some just 30 yards away across that levee in the channel. These are the fish from the channel. These are the fish from the floodplain. This is about the production of the natural environment, of the system in its unaltered state. We now know that salmon habitat isn't just sparkling streams and gravels up in the foothills, right? We need this valley floor habitat. Well, what's happened to that habitat? Here's a schematic of the diverse mosaic of different wetland habitats that salmon needed to have self-sustaining populations. Today it looks more like that. What happened to it? The green is rice land. So we know we're not going back. There's never going to be waving stands of hundreds of thousands of acres of tules again. That's not what we're calling for. We're not going to look out at a natural system. This is a highly managed system, but how do we integrate our knowledge, our burgeoning knowledge of biology, into our management of this water infrastructure? Well, that asks this question. Can we use this ag land to mimic the natural processes that once created this amazing production? that turned the sky black with ducks, that filled our rivers with fish. And that's a real important thing to think about, is that we have precedent for this idea. This isn't completely out of the blue. Our fish are facing dire straits, but we have a wonderful precedent with birds and waterfowl in the valley. Just a generation ago, farmers, the MO for rice culture was burning those fields afterwards. Clean air legislation led to a curtailment of that. The way that the rice industry evolved was to flood those fields instead of burning them. And suddenly, those ducks and geese that for generations had looked down on the Pacific flyway, the absolutely integral Central Valley to 20% of the continent's birds, suddenly they looked down, those birds, and saw a wetted Central Valley again. Those wetlands, which are a minor change in agricultural protocol, still a very vibrant rice industry in the valley, have led to more ducks and geese being counted in the valley than ever before. In a world that is facing environmental catastrophe everywhere, where you hear about the bleak circumstances, we have to look here and see right in our backyard, as an unintended consequence of clean air legislation, we had a landscape level change in how we manage our lands that resulted in huge conservation benefit. There's some major issues here. Birds can find that habitat. It's harder to get a fish out of the river onto the floodplain. That's why we chose YOLO bypass. Here's one of the places. How much time do I have? 2 minutes? One of the places within the system where you still do have connectivity between the river and the floodplain, with putting together a team, a private-public partnership, conservation money, partnered with farmers, partnered with every resource agency you can think of, NOAA, the State Department of Fish and Wildlife, DWR, the list goes on and on, with academic scientists, with NGOs like Trout, like myself, all coming together for this vision that says if we're going to meet co-equal goals, we have to integrate a working science-based knowledge of the natural system into our management of our water infrastructure. To do that, we did a series of experiments looking at how agriculture can meet the needs of fish on the floodplain. We were looking at the different habitat types or different options a farmer might have in doing his fields. I'm not going to get into the details here because the major story is this. In putting fish out onto a flooded rice field, a rice field which mimics the habitats under which they evolved and to which they're adapted, we had incredible response. We documented the fastest growth of salmon ever documented in the Central Valley. Something as simple as this, understanding the engine of production in the old system, in the natural system, that when water slows down, spreads out, it creates an incredible amount of food, and that food is the basis for many of our different aquatic species that are now threatened. The point here again is these are the fish being produced by the Central Valley today. They're small, they're malnourished, and they're going out into a system at the wrong timing. Time is an incredible part of this that I'd love to get into in more detail, but won't. You'll have to trust me on it. This is what a Central Valley salmon should look like. This is a fish that's packed its lunch. It's going to make it when there's not quite enough food out in the ocean. It can get away from predators, and it will return. If you give native organisms a system they recognize, we will have a completely different outcome. And that's something we're just realizing. It isn't Fisher Farm. The idea is, and the reason we're in this predicament where we are facing extinction in a myriad of different places, is because it's not a consequence of, an inevitable consequence of progress versus environmental degradation. Instead, it's the consequence of an infrastructure that was built at a time when we didn't understand the system which we've altered. That can be changed. That's happening across our different disciplines, whether it's the management of our forests, understanding that fire is an integral part of the West Forest. It's the same true with architecture, where just 2 generations ago we built our skyscrapers so strong that they wouldn't fall. Now we understand they have to sway. all of this is about incorporating our knowledge of nature into our management of it. In water, we have that capacity to do that. This drought is actually an opportunity to bring all our diverse water constituencies together to build a better system, one that meets all of our objectives better than it does today. There'll never be a panacea. No one's ever, you're never going to make everyone happy. But this is how you make salmon happy, and it couldn't happen without a really diverse group of participants.
Thank you, Jacob. So we have about 15 minutes for questions, which means I'll probably only have time for a couple. So I'll start with the big one because Tim happened to hit, and he actually had a direct comment that is one that I think underlies the most fundamental issues we have, which is just sort of how we, again, fundamentally approach things. And it relates to the difference between an all-of-the-above approach and a loading order or prioritization. And, we all know all the above. When President Obama first said that about energy policy a couple of years ago, it was literally like fingernails on a chalkboard to me. And he reiterated in the most recent, I think there is a fundamental a fundamental difference in how you look at things and how you want to invest your resources. And so without me going further into it, because I'll take away what the panel is, I would love to hear sort of compare and contrast and debate a prioritization approach to water versus an all of the above. And I'll throw it, I guess, in whatever order you guys want to start the dialogue going.
Well, I'm not sure how much you want to nibble at this bait. Our organization doesn't think prioritization is in which one group in the political fight gets to say, my stuff is more important than your stuff. That's never going to succeed. So I think a comprehensive approach holds folks together, and it's got to be built around this concept of co-equal goals. I will sink my roots really deep there. But I really enjoyed Jacob's presentation. I asked him on the way over here, was he familiar with Butte Creek, which is up near Chico, one of the most successful restoration efforts on salmon, spring run salmon in this case. And I was the guy directing the money from Southern California. It's one of the things I'm most proud of in my career. But the prioritization approach most often is, I think my stuff is more important than your stuff. Step aside, don't complain. I don't think that gets us where we need to go. We've got to build a future around co-equal goals, and you know what? It's going to require some storage. It's going to require a change in where in how we maneuver water across the delta. You can hide from that fact, but it's still there. It's still real. So I guess I'm going to stand my ground that we need to check the box next to all of the above, not just the one that some of you guys might like better than some of the ones that. By the way, I give the same speech to my folks. Their prioritization, guess what, would be different than yours. But we need something that's moving the whole system forward, not just one segment of it.
I don't know if we need this microphone or whether it's useful or not, but I am going to rise to that bait. The idea of all of the above is appropriate when we're evaluating our options. I'm a big fan of all of the above in the sense of a portfolio approach. But all of the above can't mean that we do everything. We can't do everything. We don't have the money to do everything. Not everything is smart to do at the same time. And so I support the all of the above conceptually. I don't support all of the above operationally. I think we have to set priorities. And I don't know if this is a real disagreement between me and Tim or not. We'll discuss this afterwards. But as an example, again, back to this Australia drought, the Millennium Drought, their 9-year drought. Australia built 5 or 6 massive desalination plants during that drought. They did a lot of things. They restructured the Murray-Darling Basin and ecosystem rights and farmer allocations and water rights. They did some really difficult things. But they also built 5 or 6 massive desalination plants around the country. All but 1 or 2 of those plants now are mothballed because they can't afford to run them. They were too expensive. They had a couple of wet years. And so they've shut those plants down. because they're too expensive. The water that those plants produce is extraordinarily expensive. And so that's an example where an enormous amount of money and resource and time and effort went into building infrastructure that may not have been necessary in the way that they designed it. So let's talk about all of our options. We want to expand more than just conservation and efficiency, more than just supply. We want to expand the conversation, but we don't want to pursue all of the above blindly. I'll leave it at that. I'm sure there'll be more about this.
I'll jump in very quickly just to say that diversity, whether you're investing in portfolio theory or you're thinking about how crops are going to deal with pathogens, or if you're going to look at it from an ecological perspective and understand that self-sustaining populations of fish are dependent on a diverse mosaic of different habitat types. All of that is pinned on this idea of having multiple strategies. And that anytime you try to maximize any single component, you're ultimately building a brittle system and a system that will, you're courting catastrophe. So I don't think there are there's no one answer, that there definitely is a diversity of strategies that need to be employed. But that being said, you're going to have high leverage options, and those have to be prioritized. Often, though, I think the filter of understanding that high leverage is seeing those projects that really meet the needs of multiple constituencies, understanding that multiple benefits is going to be necessary in creating the infrastructure of the future.
Obviously, Bruce, this was a good question. Again, we can do all of the above. Peter, I've been part of all of the above strategies. You can do them. I came into this business in 1985, 3 years after the Peripheral Canal vote. At the time, Southern California's vision was very focused on one thing, one tool that was going to solve their problem: Complete the State Water Project. I used to listen to the Complete the State Water Project in my early career a lot. Every time a state bill would come in, somebody on the Met board would say, "Sue them, complete the State Water Project. They haven't fulfilled their contractual obligations." Well, there was a brilliant man who doesn't get the credit he deserves. His name was Carl Bronke, still alive. He's getting pretty old. And Bronke threw the favorite tool strategy out the window, pushed all the engineers who believed in it out of the organization, brought in an entirely new set of leadership, of which I was part, and we started in all of the above strategy. It's called an integrated resources program, and it required investing in a mind-bogglingly large number of investments. And a lot of people at the time said, too much, we can't do that, we got to prioritize, we got to focus on things. And Carl realized that only a truly comprehensive strategy was going to be successful, and we got ourselves organized, we raised the money, tapped into some federal money, state money through federal money where we could, state money where we could. The vast majority of it was local money, and we had to pursue a comprehensive strategy, and it got done, and that's why there's been a lot of progress made down there. And again, I think the same thing needs to be replicated on a statewide basis. Mom raised me to be an optimist, and she did a heck of a job, and I believe we can do comprehensive, and we must.
Hey, I know we'll take some more questions, but I just want to say one thing. I don't think an all of the above strategy and a comprehensive strategy are the same thing.
I don't mean blindly, by the way. I want to agree with you. No blind strategy.
So here's the distinction. I'm a big fan, and the Institute's talked forever about portfolio and comprehensive approach and integrated approach. So we agree completely with that. All of the above I hear as doing everything. And that's the subtlety that maybe is worth a greater discussion. I don't think we have the time or the necessity to do everything. I think figuring out how to integrate a smart, comprehensive strategy that we can afford that achieves our objectives is really what maybe we're both talking about.
Peter, you've changed my rhetoric from now on. It's going to be check the box next to intelligent, comprehensive strategy.
Who said we couldn't get consensus at the PCL Symposium? There's two questions I desperately want to ask. I'm going to try to squeeze them both in, and I'm trying to look and see if even our next round of panelists are here. The first is, we probably have somewhat different approaches, although there is a nuance here in the all of the above. And frankly, we tend to go into our boxes. It's us versus them and what have you. And I do think there's a lot of areas of agreement. And so my question, and recognizing it's somewhat loose end, is how do we break down those barriers? Because we are in a crisis or an opportunity that is unprecedented in California. How can we figure out how to agree on the things we disagree, work together, on the areas of consensus? And again, maybe, Tim, it makes most sense to start with something like Jacob has done it on the ground. I'd love to hear from all three of you on that.
He said, start with you, Jim.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's work. The NAGS project itself is built upon this very idea. Yes, I'm here talking about it, but the reason I'm talking about it is because we did it. And the action, getting your hands wet, getting out there and doing it with a diverse partnership, because it's always going to be a diverse partnership. That's the way to do it. And especially, I'm particularly proud of the private-public partnership that's there at NAGS. And I think that often we see that within our agricultural landscape, where real innovation happens. It happens by allowing the partners to do what they do best. UC Davis, one of our integral partners, the Center for Watershed Sciences, could really bring the scientific rigor that we needed. DWR could bring that scientific rigor and also help an incredible amount with the regulatory kind of burden that was there, permitting and so forth. The farm knowledge to run a 2,000-acre rice, that had to be there with an active farm partner. Getting out there and doing these small projects that are small enough that you can bite off, you can chew them, but you can demonstrate unequivocal success. I think that's what pulls the whole thing forward. It's hard to push the water discussion forward, but I think that it'll move forward pulled by the gravity of success and of demonstrated projects. So.
I pretty much, me too. We need to spend more time in the same room. I think that's why my friend Jonas asked me to be here today. Early in my career, I spent a lot of time working with Northern California environmentalists, and I don't think that happens much anymore, probably more than I realize, but we need to spend more time in more rooms, and we need to see joint successes. The projects that I really enjoy, a lot of restoration projects I've been up to my eyeballs in, it had just what Jacob just talked about. I mean, diverse set of people who had differences and had to work them out, but they had a common goal in getting something done instead of just fighting with each other and playing gotcha.
So I'll just add to what both Jacob and Tim have said, and we're sharing a microphone, so I have to get closer and closer to the first is crisis. There's nothing like a crisis to actually change the conversation a little bit. And in that sense, as bad as this year is going to be, I think, I'm afraid, there's some opportunities. So that's one. The second is conversation. You don't make progress unless you're talking. And Tim mentioned that, and I think some of the conversations we'll have today, and I think hopefully some of the conversations that we'll have during the rest of the year will move in that direction. The third is abandon your ideology, not non-ideology. The Pacific Institute, we're a research institute. People think they know what we think, but we find ourselves debating with people who think they ought to be our friends and yet aren't sure where we stand on certain things. We're not anti-desalination. We published a whole series of reports on the costs and benefits of desalination. We're opposed to bad desalination, but we're opposed to bad conservation ideas too. And so non-ideology is important, and it's often hard to get out of our boxes, as somebody's already mentioned. And the fourth point is successes. Again, Tim mentioned this, and this is what Jacob's talking about. There are a lot of really smart, innovative things going on statewide now in the water area. At the Institute, we have on our website something called the California Farm Water Success Stories, which are stories where growers or irrigation districts are doing really innovative things around water. There are all sorts of successes out there, and we could talk about what doesn't work, but if we talk about what works and how to make those things that work more effective, that's another way forward and another way to break down the barriers.
Excellent. I'm trying to look to some direction myself. I'm going to try to get one more really quick question in, and it builds on that. I think as much as it may not sound like I'm actually an optimist, and if there's one silver lining with how dire the water situation is this sense of, okay, we can finally make big change. But the history of, frankly, California and the country is that even really bad crises don't always lead to fundamental change. And you look at the, oil embargoes of the early 70s, it didn't really fundamentally change the way we design cities. The water in the late 70s in California. We have a limited time to take advantage of this crisis and make it an opportunity. How do we not blow it and get more fundamental change? In 1 minute.
Well, that's the hard thing. One of my favorite books is East of Eden by John Steinbeck, and there's a great quote in the first 40 pages. In the wet years, they forgot about the dry years, and in the dry years, they forgot about the wet years, and it was always that way, and it always will be. That's a paraphrase. His language is much more eloquent, believe me. So we hope this drought ends tomorrow. If it does, the pressure for some of these changes is gonna disappear again. So I hate to say that some of us sort of hope that the drought continues long enough to lead to some fundamental changes that reduce the costs to all of us of bad water management. I hate to say it that way, but bad crises don't always lead to change, and I think we have a limited set of opportunity, limited time here to do the right thing, and I just hope we'll take advantage of the time that we have.
I think we have a huge opportunity in 2014. Again, I've got members who may run out of water. You may see communities of tens of thousands of people who, when they turn their taps, the water doesn't come out. Think about that for a few minutes. This is scary stuff. So part of me agrees with Peter, and part of me would like to see it rain like hell the next month. The long-term forecasts are not very encouraging. People may not always respond to crisis, but I think oftentimes they do. It creates an opportunity, so if the crisis continues, let's not waste it. I would argue from the 87, and this is my fourth drought in California. 3 of them I was a professional water manager. The first one was 1987 to 1992. It was a lesson. It was a crisis. Southern California went to mandatory rationing. This was very much against the pride and policies of the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, and there was a collective this will never happen again. And that completely changed how Southern California looked at water management, completely. They went from complete to state water project to we'll take whatever you can give us. 25 years ago, if you talked about a year in which the project would deliver 0 at a time when they needed it most when they signed their contracts, that would have been heresy. And today, they take it in stride because they completely changed how they think about managing resources. And it took a crisis to get there, and I frankly want to grow that mentality with this crisis to statewide proportions. So it's never going to be easy to get through a 2014. This is just so scary dry. But if we invest in tools where we can replicate some of those successes, when it comes around again in 20 or so years, we can have a lot more tools to manage for both fish and the environment, and we'll be in much better shape. So let's take advantage of this crisis.
I don't think you can argue with not wanting to waste a good crisis. That's that's pretty straightforward, and it tends to be how policy works in some ways. But I have to admit personally that nothing would make me happier if I walk out those doors and it's raining cats and dogs. I mean, there's enough fish in me to know that we need that water. That being said, this is California, and the next crisis may not be a drought. It's just as likely to be a flood. That we need to design a system that understands that variation is the only constant. That we need to have a system that mimics those natural processes in ways that really allow us to better manage water and to do it in a way that allows our native species to recognize the system. If we do that, everyone's better off.
Excellent. And this is a perfect segue into our next panel, which is what the legislature and the water bond are going to be looking to take advantage. So with that, I want to thank you. I think this is a great way to kick off this.